this computer because the cloud costs. We are recording, and then I'll share the screen in all its glory. So this is now an anecdotal example of one case from the kind of palette. So this is actually a page from the Wonder Home game we were processing earlier, and I was following some of the conversation around it, and there's another Martin joining.
Sorry, I need to log in from the tablet because otherwise I cannot see your screen. It's on my phone right now. So
all right, okay, yeah, no problem.
I leave from this one though.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, just making sure. So the as an example, so this conversation around Wonder Home came to this, like, how does some of its mechanics and how some of its approaches influence situations, both kind of create situations, but also modify them. And to use this as an example, so in that game, you have this sort of almost like building blocks for what they call natures. But so they can be, a bridge, an island, a forest, a marketplace, whatever, like this kind of basic elements. But they're also like interesting in the sense that they work both concretely and abstractly. So I think, for example, the tower is described as something that reaches towards the skies. Well, also the bridge here is described is a passage from one place to next. So that can be highly metaphorical. And that's saying intently that you can use this for a real concrete bridge in the game world, but you can use it for anything that is bridging. And how it works here is like, okay, you're thinking of including a bridge, and then it gives these certain elements to it. For example, there's this place can always describe the distance to the other side, push something off the edge, and offer someone an easier way. And then there's even give someone a token if you don't make it. But the key thing I wanted to point out here is like, for example, if you were to describe a member in a way that they would have similarly things that they can do always. And it's Jacob. So for example, this member can always propose a settlement to a conflict. It doesn't seem like much, but having experience of these kind of games, it actually does affect things. Like people like can utilize these kind of structures to. It's almost like self-suggestion or group suggestion. Oh, okay, now we take this as a solution or settlement. But of course, there could be something more, I don't know, exotic. They don't have to be all this sort of like what you would expect from an organization in itself. But also like they are in a way soft, like because they function within expressions like sentences, you can make them softer or harder depending on how you express them. So really here, the skill of development is not just the mechanic itself, is what's described within. But having a member described in this kind of manner, or that they would always have available, the sort of like, oh, I can do this and this, and then that would open up this sort of like way to address things that are not just like, well, I'm the programmer, I say this area. Of course, it allows for that if you put like a hard rule, but it also allows for like addressing more playful possibilities, addressing things that are not so norm in terms of structures. Second part is choose here the choose two aesthetic elements. which is really like just populating the environment. It's suggestions again. Like, of course, it's saying a hard rule, choose two, but the main point here is like you're mentally looking at like ancient engineering, rickety planks, sudden drop, and something of them speaks to you, and then you add them, but that also helps you to create the bridge in itself. But now if we turn to organizations, what if we think of a scene, a project, and what if a project is described like this, that every time you're, let's say, engaging in a session in the project, you have this list that you have generated that describes the project itself, and you say, okay, now I would say that this session has like not ancient engineering, but it has like a let's say development of the concept of a token, or adding more details to adding new understandings to the concept of a token, for example, or it could be even something more social, like uh, finding new structures of how do we communicate, and like utilizing such a description and then utilizing this game mechanic, like for each session, like let's say we define 2 or 3 or whatever, which we set as the starting point. Now I know in play, just like these kind of games, those actually don't become shackles. Like if somebody starts with like, oh, the bridge has ancient engineering and then forgets it, but the environment generated from it is interesting, it's completely fine. And that actually.
Pekko, can I ask you something
Yeah.
before you continue? Maybe this has to be answered at a later point, but correct me if I'm wrong. Like you are now using from the game manual here. There were these kind of symbolic affordances, right, from off
Yes.
the bridge, and then there were these aesthetic kind of evocations, and then when you translate, when you which both I think are kind of presented as means to open spaces, or like define spaces of imagination or of action or of decision and so. And then when you then move to the organizational example, did you choose now this kind of more, so to speak, functionalistic parameters to describe a certain session, like because like on what reason did you choose, like, let's make this session about defining a token, and why is it? Because I think I'm asking because I find it really interesting to be like, if I would find myself confronted in a kind of project meeting, and I would be kind of, so to speak, initiated into the session by way of such a symbolic space, or by some aesthetic kind of evocations, rather than what now for me kind of felt a bit like a goal maybe, or a focus of. But so I just wanted to understand why and for what reason you made the kind of translation the way you did.
No, that's a really good question, because, well, first of, like, taking this topic of evocation, like you said, in this game, they are aesthetic evocations, but it's good to underline that they're also functional. They're actually kind of more functional, but yes, in a different way than the kind of straight goal. But the functionality of them is like, oh, you have to generate a new place. Okay, you chose your elements as the bridge, and maybe you mix that with the tower or something. But then what these lists offer you is like starting points, essentially. And the choosing here is really like almost like something is broadly painted on the empty canvas, and then that gives a starting point that you see a bridge that has some engineering, and then you describe more what the engineering is. It is aesthetic, but it's also very functional in terms of the game to have something there. Now, why I'm pointing that it's not actually only aesthetic in the traditional sense, because it's really mean to some. It's almost like generating a board, like that's a board on which to play on. I'm pointing that out because in this kind of mechanics, you can do functional evocation, you can do aesthetic evocation, you can do many kinds of evocation, and you can mix and match. So my reason probably making this sort of, let's say, conservative examples was maybe try to ground it. Maybe it was kind of too safe, but kind of making it like this might seem far from organization, but here's some examples that kind of ground it maybe more traditionally. But my point is not let's move it to traditional. My point is actually that the whole space is open. Like, yes, you could even in organization approach this sort of aesthetic elements. Like uh, in an organization, you might be not be generating an imaginary world, but what if the aesthetic is like a, a an a warm environment, or like a, now I'm coming up empty, but you could, for example, evocate certain kind of atmospheres, but it works the same way. And me being a nerd in games, I always see the mechanics first. It's a habit in and I get really enthused by the mechanics, and then I like often don't say out loud that actually there's all these kind of that what is the range that the mechanics allows, and that's maybe the most interesting thing here, that because everything is an expression, and the expression actually has many roles, even though they are defined here as aesthetic, they could be something else, they could be a mix of things. And the same goes for this sort of, this place can always, which could be this person can always, or this member can always, or this project can always. Yes, they could be functional as my examples, but once again, it's open to the same mixing. The same thing applies towards that. So it actually opens a larger design ground than, let's say, my examples bring out. So yeah, is that does that answer the question?
It certainly did, and I just think, like, for me, I would be just wanting to throw a token at the further exploration of these various ways of evocation, or of kind of opening action spaces.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because I agree with you very much on the like aesthetic as a deep field. Like, I don't think it's it doesn't it's not exhausted in observation, like visual observation and nothing more, but I think
Yeah.
it has a kind of absolutely like a mechanic depth. But that's exactly the reason why I find that it would be super interesting or to explore this further. But yeah, thanks for the clarification. It was the answer to the question that I had.
Good, because that's kind of the idea. I'll promise I finish my descriptions in 1 minute, because the idea is actually trying to test this part, and this is one of the snippets, or one of the mechanics that I was thinking of testing out. But the final thing to describe this last one, which is choose one folklore about this place. And you notice that there are essentially like fairy tale titles, like The Path Carved by the Giant King, Fox and the Toad Crossing. What interests me here is that it's outlining actually that different kind of expressions take a different functional role. In minority readings, it's functional. So if you think of like how let's say the rickety planks works, and in this imaginary world, you're thinking, oh, what kind of bridge is it? Like, I choose rickety planks and I say that it's constantly creaking in the wind, and more details come in, and the game is kind of serving its purpose, so on and so forth. But if I think of like that, I choose one folklore, which is, let's say, the Fox and the Toad Crossing, that's functioning more like a title, and it's not giving me like actually a detail, more like an overview, a thematic essentially. But inside there, it's actually a point that there is. It's kind of too crude to call them categories, but maybe like different operations that these kind of mechanics can work in. Because like I can even see it in gameplay, like when people use something like a folklore, they actually start from this sort of maybe vague sense of the story that they tell, like, oh, the first sentence in play might be, as you remember, what happened to the fox in the Fox and the Toad Crossing, and they might not, of course, even have any more details towards that story. And then somebody mentions like yeah, it was killed, and like some no, it was just kind of thrown off the road and so on, like, and the story starts to form in itself. So it's like, very roughly speaking, that's almost like top down to the bottom up of the aesthetic element. And with that, I want to point that it's not actually just one type of evocation, but a type of expression thought of as types, as also this game seems to understand. The types can serve different points. Like, to use my boring examples, is if somebody would have put a title, which would be a social form of a token, and that would be always available, it would be almost like a reminder, which would always emphasize the social part, sort of almost like a question that people can return again and again. But it's almost like if this would be a way to create a kind of a playboard for a project, it would mean that the social form of a token would be always at hand or nearby. And when it would be nearby or at hand, it would be more likely to be evoked, and therefore probably affect subtly but significantly the nature of the project itself. Uh, so so I think underneath here is a much larger approach. It's not invented by this game, although I think it makes a pretty good implementation, very minimalist, very effective. But the larger approach is not just aesthetic elements, it's not just titles and details, but it's about like this sort of like how to have something at hand that affects the play, how to have a board in the sense of a board game, not a organizational board, that is present in whatever happens, whether it's a person affecting their character in the organization, or whether it's a project affecting the process of the project. Okay, I'll shut up for now. That was too long, but that's kind of my introduction to this approach to game mechanics and game generation. Any reactions, questions? I encourage the questions, like Martin questions was I think really on point, because it also revealed things that were unsaid and were good to be said.
I'm reminded in a way of like and I don't want to draw like too close of a link here, but I'm reminded in a way of like tarot cards. Not that I would know anything about them, but like the way I've been now seeing people use them as kind of. I know exactly nothing about it except for that they exist and they've covered. But like the way that I see people using them in contexts that. Yeah, in context of speech or kind of, you know, creation of a certain sense of place or something like that. This is kind of what this reminded me just now of, and a bit this feeling, which I think is kind of it would feel kind of at the same time explorative and generative, I would suppose, like explorative also maybe in an introspective sense, that you kind of in some way you start painting with metaphors, right?
Yes.
Like you
even building.
Yeah, exactly. And I think so when I say painting and I use this aesthetic concept or like term, then I think really what I mean is building, because there was this fantastic exhibition called Constellations, and it was a kind of aesthetic space that really was that doesn't make sense if you didn't see it, but like just to say that I think yeah. So but what I think could be interesting and is really these both directions. First, where are you going? Like, what are the spaces that you're creating when you kind of provide this kind of toolbox of metaphors of different types, but also I would really feel that it would be like a kind of sensory instrument about what is it where you think you are, like what do you know about yourself, and like it's an introspective kind of work at the same time.
Yeah, agreed. I think actually the introspection, which can be personal introspection or even group introspection, also in a sense project introspection, if it's a group inside a project, is actually a very useful tool. And I won't open the can of worms of tarot because it's something Thea knows about, because Thea is also included in another project that I have outside of X, or well, somewhat connected actually, but let's say loosely, which is called Tarot, or Art of Tarot, which is about generalizing tarot and how it's not actually about the cards, but it's the way of interpretation. But anyway, I can that description for now because I think it's an interesting project and maybe even relevant here, but it's kind of maybe too much stuff here. But the one thing I wanted to point out, because I agree with your description that there is a similarity, but there is towards this sort of building or painting, there is kind of extra. That is, what the game is bringing is also additional structure. That, like, if you take a tarot card and say, oh, let's say for our project, we take these 3 tarot cards. Well, that can work, but it's also quite ambiguous, and that ambiguous might be interesting, but also might be a problem. But here, like this, as you can see, it's actually a combination of almost like hard mechanics and very, very soft mechanics. The hard mechanics is like choose 2 aesthetic elements. Oh, you take this place, choose that. That's very kind of black and white. But then what you choose is actually uh, uh, very soft expressions. But if you read the whole game, it's not even that you use the exact words. It's about like you choose something that you immediately kind of mold into different forms. But what the hard mechanics is doing is creating a design space that allows you to go further into structure and lessen the ambiguity, or and in many ways from what would be just like laying out 3 tarot cards. And that is an optional space. You don't have to use that, or you can use it a little or more, or you can use it this way, that way, and practical infinity amount of ways. And this is, I think, where why this is kind of something related, but also something that opens up other possibilities. It really goes to this question, which I think is kind of one thematic, at least for me today, is like, what would it be like, or what would it be like to play in an organization, or what would be an organization sense as play to be? And I think it's a very snapshot moment, but you can think of this moment that, oh, my board or my character sheet like thing is today this, like, oh, I take my uh, member role character as a sheet, which might be like this, and then I take the project sheet, and or maybe we add a couple of elements to this, and then we start the session by choosing a couple and say, okay, since we have these topics today, that leads to here and here, and and I think there is something interesting in that direction overall, and something very expanding in terms of how do we think of structures in an organization. Any other comments, questions? Anybody else? This is what I get from talking too much. You're punishing me for a good reason.
Just maybe this question, like if, sorry.
No.
I think I
just had a comment that it just like once again really opens up these kind of fields that we tend to forget that they are creative, or that we tend to forget that we are constantly taking decisions, or kind of are evading to come up with solutions because we are, I don't know, in a habit or something. But we always decide for a certain form, how we meet, how we like, what are the spaces, what are the social conventions we meet in, and it just like takes that from coming from a default setting into like really opening this up. And for me it's so interesting because it kind of puts an emphasis on the process or the project. It's not about this we are doing it the way we always do it, and then something is coming out and it's about this product that should be, I don't know, right on you or in a certain way. But we are already thinking about how does the process that we are developing this project, how is that already part of this project, and how does already things we want to bring about in this become part of the development, so to say. So it's, like for me, it really opens these questions of, like not working towards a goal, but kind of constantly being in this process that is already part of what I want to bring into this world in a way.
Yeah, it's exactly like getting your fingers into the process and molding the process. Not necessarily like that you can predict it exactly, but you know when you push from here or when you add this, it will probably add this and these kind of qualities. And then from there, like placing like different kind of molds or structures in the process, you can find new ways to navigate it, and like that, I think it's the interesting thing. And you're completely right on this, like that every structure we come to or operate in is a design, but often approach in an automated fashion that the design is kind of forgotten because the choices are automated. But you could take, say, theater, and you could break it down that, like, well, the audience is actually, you're a participant, but you have this right of choosing your seat, and you're expected to be silent, but you also have this right of thinking anything and speaking anything about what you're seeing, etc. And you could expand that to the actual process of creating the piece or playing the piece, which is like, you're an actor, you have this right. Let's say it's a traditional piece, and like there's this text that is given, but you have the right to kind of intone and express that text in whatever manner. But then this person, who is called the director, they have a right to evaluate or comment upon your expressions and so on and so forth. And sure, that's very Lego blocky, but it's also like a way to then immediately think, okay, what if we change this or that or this or that or this? And this is where things get useful and interesting in itself. But my proposal would be, what if we test this? Like if we take, let's say, some speculative scene. It could be, for example, like taking this session right here, or imagining a session maybe in the future of XORG or something completely different, and think about generating these kind of elements for it. Like, it doesn't have to follow this model. This is kind of like a springboard, but we could, you know, express, maybe even write up these kind of elements, and then, like, maybe very shortly, but still potentially test them in play. But what kind of speculative? First of all, is that okay? Does that sound a sensible playtest situation?
Did you leave?
No, sorry, it's my camera. Oh.
That was too much.
Yeah.
I would just like to, even though that I just have to say it maybe for myself, I think it's a super good idea, and I think that's like I'm fully up for it. I just wanted to, because of the last thing that I asked, and maybe Thea was also pointing a bit at that. That the roles that we kind of, or that I kind of maybe called a little bit more functional, are maybe just simply because they, like you were just saying, I think, because they're way more normalized, right? Like, we don't kind of question those anymore. And it's a bit funny, like I was listening to you now saying, like, the director and the actor, there's a certain, there's, of course, there's many models built into that, like many hierarchies and many distributions of agency and so stuff. And it's a bit kind of funny that those would kind of appear functional, as if neutral, and others would kind of appear of a different, maybe aesthetic or somewhat, like, you know, capacity, as if those others wouldn't have them. So I guess they're just like naturalized in a way. But like that, I just want to maybe pin that for myself. But I think it's a really nice proposal to go and what you just said, try these out for some of them. Yeah.
Any proposals for what kind of a scene we could take? Like, any points of interest? Can be sort of pragmatic interest or imaginary interest.
I could have maybe one which is maybe close from my side, but maybe it makes it has some application here. As a scenario, maybe the idea of how to create bridges, let's say. Sorry.
No, that's how they affect you. That's the point.
Exactly. That's it. I have no more. Between organizations, between different organizations. As we spoke on the phone, Pekko, and like lately, something that interests me very much. Like, so you have organizations that kind of individuate themselves, and how to kind of have a meta, you know, web or something like that between them. As a, I don't know if that's a kind of, that's what you were asking for now, but I thought, like, maybe as a kind of, so to speak, don't want to say goal, but kind of maybe motive or so, maybe could that serve?
Yeah, that's an interesting topic. Like as a kind of immediate reaction, think about this as a bridge. Of course, I'm not saying it's the only bridge, but what I'm saying with that is, what if two organizations that are individual, so to speak, agree that there is this game board between them, or they play a certain kind of game sometimes between them, but it's a game organization in itself, like that, that you have, for example, this kind of mechanism, and that sets up a relation. And of course, how it's designed can make it also effective, like maybe like, for example, you could have a category of goals here, and it would work. Like here is the kind of folklore, which is the title, and then there's details, which is the aesthetic elements, and then there's like moves and operation, which is the this place can always. But you could have a fourth one here, which says goals, and then choose a goal. And if you were thinking like, oh, these two organizations come together and there's a game and there is this goals, and maybe those goals are defined like titles, like for example, the earlier, what was the I can't remember the exact sentence, but the social token structure. And there's once again a practical infinity to answer that. But if that's a goal, defined as a goal, it becomes something that is pursued. And if it's pursued, it becomes something that is shared between organizations. Not that it needs to have a goal, but that's just yet another element of how this, around this kind of approach, there is a lot of other possibilities as well. How does that kind of situation, this sort of like bridge state or transition space or between space between organizations, how does it sound to others?
I like it. Yeah, I think it has a lot of potential.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Jakub, any reactions? Any wishes, modifications, also mutations?
Yeah, I'm sorry for today. I'm a bit more passive because I'm really tired, so I'm mostly listening in. But for me, one association was for me with the bridge space, also kind of the metaphor of the membrane, and various ways how this kind of affordances of this metaphor could be useful. But yeah, it's just very pre-thought because my brain today is not working that much.
No, that's okay. It's one has to be able to join whatever the state, and it's all towards the good. But actually, the point you made, membrane, like that makes me think of like what if there was like this kind of a surface between two organizations, and that would allow them to make moves toward each other. Like it's almost like you think of like a email-based chess game, and at some point you get an email, oh, they made a move, and now I have to think of another move, and then you make a move back. Not that it has to be that slow, or to be also played in certain sessions, whatever the structure, but it's kind of passing through back and forth, and you can then design that membrane. Like, what if the organizations see that membrane as a way to push challenges to the other organization? Not in a negative sense, but in the sense of like, what do you think of this? Or, well, that's just one approach.
Thanks. That's interesting.
But if you think of that, okay, like I think also there is a whole gradient between it being a membrane or a space. Like if it's like even the chess moves are feel like a membrane, but then the chessboard is a space. Similarly, if the groups come together, like and 2 hours every week and play this sort of some kind of thing that leaves, maybe it creates challenges for them. That's a space again, but then it also creates the element that like a membrane. So it's a design space for both. But if we think of that possibility, since there seems to be agreement, unless Dea wants to voice mutation or disagreement. What kind of transition bridge space membrane we would like to create? So if we start kind of turning the camera from blurry to more and more detail, like sharpen it.
just for a question for my understanding, Pekko,
Mhm.
is it now so that you would like to take us into, so to say, kind of working on this kind of the kind of various expressions of, or like suggestions for
Yeah.
what we could exist with, so that we kind of start imagining different metaphorics, different aesthetics, in order to kind of explore that design space. Is that what
Yes.
you suggest?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Drafting that, like,
Right.
and because it's drafting, it doesn't have to be this is the best thing ever, but really like throwing. And meanwhile, when throwing them in, one can kind of imagine around it how it would play. It, of course, there's always the possibility that it's simply this sort of like like the simplest way of for me to think of membrane would be like two organizations have this almost like the sheet between them, and then for example, one organization can always X, Y, and Z to the other organization, and that's a very simple way to get to creating a membrane, like um, that like one organization can always propose a challenge to the other, or but of course it could be something wider. It doesn't have to be that simplistic, but which is not a bad thing, the simplicity, just as an example. So yes, like drafting towards this sort of expressions and thinking about the role of those expressions or categories, roughly speaking. Styles is maybe another word for this category. And then imagine like in what kind of framework could they be functioning? Is it just like this, or is it something different? That's a scintillate.
I'm thinking of yeah, I mean, there's like, if you have two different organizations, right, in different places, spaces, mental spaces, there's like, I imagine at least initially two ways of connecting them. One of them is if they remain in their space and you bridge from one to the other, right? So there's like one sort of like new space that comes in between them, or you can sort of displace them to the point where they intersect.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. So I'm thinking, for example, if one organization is chess, the game chess, and the other organization is the game backgammon.
Yeah.
What if you would create a scenario where you combine the squares of chess with the stripes of backgammon, and you take some rules of both of them, and you just bring the pieces together, and you play a
like
game
a metamorphosis. Yeah.
Yes, and you play chess gammon for once and see what happens, right?
Yeah.
It will probably be a very fun, very failed game. So yeah, so that's I guess if you put them in between and what emerges in the middle. And if you bridge between them, I feel that's more of that feels to me more political or more careful in a way. It's like it's a thin. The bridges are thin. They're very expensive to build, right? So it's I don't know. In Holochain we have a concept called the neighborhoods. Neighborhoods are like communities, and there's to bridge between two communities. There's a concept that's called memetic bridges, which is when someone who is part of both communities can sort of like stake the reputation of a person who wants to go into a new community. So you can bring your reputation from one community to another through a person who belongs to both and can sort of like argue in your favor in a way.
Yeah.
I don't know, just some ideas that came to mind.
Yeah, I mean, that is like a right structure that becomes then a move. Like when there is a situation that somebody wants to join the other community, then everybody who is member of both has this right of staking. That's and like this is for me like precisely looking at this sort of, it's an example form, but it's kind of entering into the space like where you can think that you have this cluster. The organization has these cluster structures, like in this case the neighborhoods, and then what is actually the kind of passage between the neighborhoods? As an example, what if one designs a way for the neighborhoods to communicate? Not that there has to be such a design, but then that's a kind of new ground in itself. Like what if the neighborhoods can propose questions for other neighborhoods? Or what if they can propose questions like on the sky, that it kind of is a presence for all the neighborhoods? And there are questions that then are kind of optional, but then everyone in every neighborhood has the right to create answers for that question, like not necessarily the answers, but kind of generate that material. And this becomes its own layer of filling. And that creates, of course, a different sense of community around the neighborhoods. Not saying that's the optimal design or that Holochain needs to have that, but it's like pointing this sort of design space in itself, and how these kind of structures can be actually a kind of element of community, structuring community, essentially. But I think this conversation is entering into an interesting ground, because now we are thinking also what would be the form and the function of this bridge, like including your metamorphosis. I'm just using the bridge because that was the earlier concept, like that, and you could form a hybrid in between. And many of these examples are in and of themselves interesting. Does anybody think of other examples of such forms that kind of function in between?
I will get. Oh, Jakob.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but perhaps sorry, it's a bit out there, perhaps like in the theoretical kind of
No problem.
range, but I was reminded of Markov blankets, kind of the concept from I don't know what's the branch of mathematics called, but kind of the mathematical model, which is when the Markov blanket is actually the layer which is mediating between the environment and kind of the inside of the network. And I think it's kind of being used a lot in the free energy principle from Carl Friston, and he's using it to model different kinds of perceptive or cognitive agents. And but yeah.
Is the Markov blanket built out of Markov chains, or is it a different concept altogether? You're muted.
I don't think it's built from Markov chains, but it's related concept. I can share the link because I found it quite interesting, because they were like using the concept as a one possible way how to kind of illustrate the very simplest basis of life or like cognitive agents. So that was, yeah, that's kind of somewhere else probably.
Yeah, no, but it's interesting. Maybe for also like further research. Like I'm not familiar with Markov blankets, but I'm familiar with Markov chains and their basic functionality, which are quite interesting. Used to, before the machine learning, they were the main text generation algorithm were usually Markov chains.
Mm-hmm.
But you were saying, Martin, also something.
Yeah, just like kind of bit associative, I guess. There were a couple of things that came to my mind when Pablo mentioned the membrane as a sense of relay, or like as a kind of means of connecting between organizations. And I think it's one that I find rather interesting, because it also includes this what is a personal interest of mine, also this kind of separation, this continuing separation. There's a connection, but also a separation. And then I was thinking where would such membrane have to be suspended from? Because if it's attached to one organization, then it's really just like, then it's their skin to some extent.
Yes.
And if it was suspended from the other one, then it would be their skin. So you would come to a sense of real kind of touch, some kind of closeness of some sort. And then I thought, so, okay, if you want to have it really membrane, then it would have to be suspended from some third kind of, entity. I don't know, and what I thought is also maybe then interesting with this would be that and I'm just improvising now about kind of what could be this particular element, but I would think what could be interesting is this kind of the membrane as an element of inscription, like something that is inscribed. And then, I mean, if you want to go all visual, then it would be inscribed differently from two sides, minimally. So like one is always a mirror image of the other, and then I don't know. So you can, I think it's a very, very nice, funny physical object to go and have a poke at, also in terms of like what's the translucency, how stretchable, how flexible is it, but in terms of like maybe try, like because you were saying like how does it game? I think there are a couple of quite nice mechanics that could that the membrane could kind of open.
Yeah, definitely. And this is a ground actually that I spent a lot of time in. Like in the last few years, which is kind of like relational forms, roughly speaking, and kind of also forms of relational expression and in relational definition, like but not to open that can of worms, because it's big and there's a lot of worms and they're very wriggly and tangled. But to just pick a couple of worms. First, like the between, which you were describing, there's a couple of ways, quite practical ones, that you can think of the between existence. And the one easy one is that there is a way that it exists in organization 1, and there is a way that it exists in the organization 2, maybe even the same way. Like, okay, in these organizations, you can think really like this, right? So almost like openings, portals. And one portal that they have, or certain members have, or everybody has, whatever, is, for example, sending a question. And then the other organization has a portal that they have a right to send a question, but they also receive a question. And the fact that they exist in both ends sets up the relationality. So the in-between can be established by existing in 1 and 2, and the forms can even be different. And that's very practical, because if you have, like, inside an organization, there's a game board X, and inside another organization, there's the same game board or a different game board, but they correlate. And that creates the wormhole. Found actually a continuation from my worm metaphor, and now I get worm points. Anyway, but the second one, which is also practical, is actually very existing, but kind of too narrowly understood element of our culture, and that would be the offer. That is, if you think of even traditional offer, like here's a teddy bear, I'm asking €5 for it. That is actually a potential wormhole, which you can then define that, okay, this is a public right that is anybody can engage with it, but with the condition that they place €5 to it. But if they place this €5, the teddy bear travels through it, and that moment, that instance creates this wormhole that modifies both parties, the one that held the teddy bear and the one that is held the €5, and they exchange. But describing it this way is, the reason is to show like this is actually much more general form. Like, what if I put this offer up? I could create a party, or but I don't have this. This is my description. I'm somebody is I'm a DJ, and this is the kind of records I would play, and then I have some costumes, whatever. But then I would need a space. I don't have a space. Now that's a slot. It's an open potential form. And that slot might say, anybody who comes up with the proposal of space, we can talk about it. And then if that works out, that slot is filled. I also need some equipment. And once again, that's open for maybe anybody, maybe for a certain organization, whatever it is. But then if somebody brings the equipment, then that slot is filled. And then there is a slot that anybody can join this who, I don't know, to make this as an example, I use something traditional like brings in €5 for the cost of the drinks. So that's another thing to fulfill, and that might even have a mechanic of like, oh, now we actually collected €100 now, so drinks are updated. There's more drinks present, or if we collect at least 50, we organize the party, whatever it is. So this kind of an offer, it's still an offer. It functions in the same manner, but it's also like almost becoming a game board. It's a playground, but it sets a set of rules, and it's also a wormhole, but it's actually a series of wormholes of relations, which then can create this space that comes from these relations, which is the party itself. And once you go to this ground, there is a lot of expressive space there. And this is why I think offer is one of the most underappreciated, or one of the most largest expressive potential, not just economically, although it is much larger than the current economy utilizes it, but also organizationally, socially, generally. But it stems from this sort of more general sense of offer as a way to define potential, and therefore define this sort of playground-like quality to things. Anyway, now I'll close the can of worms. Those were 2 worms. But do say?
Yeah, no, this that you just mentioned made me think a lot of APIs in programming.
Yes.
Yeah, but I wouldn't want to take it too much into the software world, because I'm very much more interested into the rickety planks of the sort of like symbolic.
Yeah.
But what's positive about APIs, I believe, and could be translated to organizations, is that you formalize in a way how your membrane is open, right? Like what are the ways in which others can interface with you?
And who can?
Who can? How are you open? In what way, right? So I'm thinking, what if there would be? I believe organizations have the potential to have much more symbolic API, or a much more aesthetic and I don't know, atmospheric API that could be an interesting thought, or something we could go into.
I think this is also, I think all the topics here are really good. We're kind of taking the membrane, but also enhancing, expanding from that concept. And now that you brought this, this is like looking at a kind of more expanded perspective from the same direction of how organization is actually built in the sense of being part of a network, because it's defining its participations in the network, and that those participations can be hard coded, so to speak. We'll only take this and this, but they could also be, more interpretational, aesthetic, metaphoric. And this is also why I found this interesting as a case, because it's also defining how metaphorics and aesthetics can exist in a systematic structure, in a rules-bound take. It's certainly not the only take, but that's what it's doing, this game. So it's kind of already pointing out some possibilities of doing exactly what Pablo was describing, and then one can kind of take that into, okay, it's an organization, that makes this kind of an offer or utilizes this kind of elements as this game to make its offer, that you can always X, Y, and Z, or you can always bring us like these aesthetic elements or functions, and then whatever it is. But that becomes then a kind of offer like a membrane to which the organization has designed. And they can even mix and match the hard with the soft. Like there can be like really like the party offer. Like you could say that, let's say the space, maybe it's a soft offer in itself. Like you can always send pictures of the space, and then there's a discussion and so on. Whereas the offer of bring €5, then you get like a passage to it. That's a hard offer, but they are part of the same playground. And I think overall, this is actually already kind of outlining elements, like certain kind of topics or categories that repeat, or structures that repeat in a very wide design space, which is also very relevant. It's and fertile, because it is. I think we're already in this very much in the middle ground of this is very relevant for organizations, and it's also very informed by games, or it kind of points immediately relevancies out of these sort of game structures. So this is my way.
To recap. So when you speak about the game structures in this moment now, so these elements that we were now exploring and kind of testing imaginatively, those would be one particular sort of elements derived from like games design practices, right? So this is what we're now transferring. I think I'm just trying to kind of get my terminology straight. Right?
But yeah. Like I would say like the game design here is like lying on the side like a palette. Like this is a highlight from that palette, this game on the screen, of like, oh, we could utilize this kind of approach, or we could utilize this kind of approach in order to paint these structures in.
In the end, there is nothing kind of intrinsic to the game design palette. I mean, it's basically the way it appears now is that it would be it's a kind of excuse, like positive excuse to import mythologies or whatever symbolics from other places in order to maybe attach them to new contexts and build kind of imaginaries, or right? I mean, so that, I mean, if we use like a bridge, neither a bridge or an API or anything is attached in any way to games. They're imports from elsewhere, but we're using them in a kind of playful way, making the relationship between playing and gaming right now in order to bring something new to our understanding of organizations. Is that a bit?
I think you characterize it in a good way, but I would add a couple of things. It is also pragmatic, because like saying about this palette is like the amount of different forms in games, if you take board games, role-playing games, video games, is huge if you look at them structurally. Like for example, inside here, there are soft approaches to define, and they actually do different things. Like one is really like an operation move-like thing, like a agent does this move, this place can always. The other one is more generative, and the third one is more like one is more generated from the bottom up, and another one is more generated from the top down. But then, yeah, this is a very small snapshot of kind of possibilities. So that's a pragmatic use that, like one can think of that the game is present metaphorically, but it's also present in this, like, look at all these objects. Like, oh, we're doing this. Well, there's this kind of an approach. There's also experience, because people have played that game, of like when this kind of approach is used, there is this and this kind of effects to the behavior, which is experience that you can adopt or utilize. So yes, it has this sort of metaphoric quality, but it also has this sort of pragmatic possibility of choices and structures that are there. And a final point on this, like, it is not an accident that actually games are known to be this sort of like sponges, that they actually take everything in, like, oh, there's a Star Wars movie, let's make a board game out of it, and then let's make a role-playing game out of it, and inside the role-playing game, let's make a session out of it, which happens on this planet, which is never in the movie, but there was this one character that told about a jungle, and so on, and this is because their nature emphasizes the system and the structure rather than the surface. Like a painting starts from, or a play, or a movie, or a book, that there is an emphasis on what is the kind of media, like what's the representation we're seeing. And of course, through this representation, the point is that there is, like, you build all kinds of mental structures out of it, and that's really what you're experiencing. But there is more than a nuanced difference if you think of, yeah, you can make a representation of chess rules, like on a text. But actually, many players have never read the rules because they've learned the game through explanation. And there could be many, many different representations of it. And there's no the chess rules. There's no work of art called chess rules. And finally, for the same reason, a chess game that is played on a physical board, let's say outside, and starts raining, and then somebody snaps a picture and moves it to playing on a computer to finish the game, the change of medium is actually almost like a non-event because it's not medium dependent, because it's the system that matters. Like it wouldn't matter that they put the piece in the wrong place, because that would matter for the system. And that's like, I would call it an emphasis. Games have this emphasis on the system, whereas almost all other traditional media have the emphasis on representation. Both are representations and systems, but the emphasis matters. And this chess example is a great, I think, great at least, case of why it actually comes part of the practice. That people can do this, moving the chess game to computer without a second thought, and the representation doesn't matter at all. But oh my God, if the piece is in the wrong place, like it doesn't matter aesthetically, but it matters because the system has changed. So games are not media, for me at least. They're something else. They use media in a utilitarian fashion.
That's something that I'm going to hit my head with. I'm, you know, way deeply convinced of the formative impact of material form, and what you just said is like I would definitely try to find counterexamples in my next sleepless night about that.
I wish you a good sleepless night. It's actually weird that even the game side hasn't really explicated this. Like there is no, I probably somewhere some text, like because there's a lot of text about games, but I haven't encountered like this clearly. Like there's a little bit of the the cybertext book and so on. But like even that is a different kind of take on it. But yeah, it's for me it's a good kind of rule of thumb because it informs a lot of situations, like the chess example, and it informs us even in kind of just not even thinking about it.
I mean, just like I don't want to dive in, but just like the media, the important part about media, like or looking at media as a critical dimension of things, is toward the relationships they structure, and not well, or like first of all, so like the game played on a computer with a partner or without structures. Okay, let me not go into this. I would think of this was very intriguing now.
Yeah, I mean the whole games are not media for me. I'm making it slightly playfully as a kind of a like intentionally pushy move to also kind of underline a point, but it's not a kind of beholden point for me. It matters how, of course, one defines media, but it's a way to think about it. Like so it's not that it's some kind of like a have to fight this in itself. But the tendency I was describing, the emphasis on the system and how it's actually a very inherent part of the games, that I'm much more sure upon.
I got reminded of I'm not sure if you encountered the book Making Deep Games, which I read like quite a bit ago, but I forgot a lot of it. I need to read it once more, but I realized that it seems that that the topic of rules as a kind of let's say expressive medium or way of kind of inducing experiences or yeah, like deeper shifts, or it's kind of what I liked was that intermixing of kind of metaphor theory and linguistics and kind of the media in the book. But yeah, I just putting it there because perhaps it might be interesting for someone, and I need to
it's a good yeah. It's a good case of also this. And final point on this media is this is also the reason why you have games in every media. Like you have video games that have only sound, and of course you have a lot of games that have no sound at all, and you can certainly make a game that is only in real life, or that is only spoken on a table, and like I just could go on. Like any form, you can design a game on it. Like you can certainly design a game that is only smells, or translate chess into smell, which is done by I think it was Fluxus that did like all the chess pieces are defined by the smell, but it's chess. You have to know the pieces by smelling them. Like it works. It's not even kind of difficult. It's kind of wonky, but it's not difficult to do because the emphasis on the system creates plasticity on the media because the media is utilitarian. Like, which is not a denigrating way of looking at it, but it's like we use media to express the system. But anyway, so but I do think like from here, I reveal one move, which is kind of in the background. I was thinking of saying it in the end, but I do think it might give direction here. So I was thinking there's also there's potential connections, and there's maybe even some possibilities for this group to collaborate, and so like maybe talk about them later. But that made me think, like, what could this group launch or express or bring others to collaboration, whatever, however it happens. And my first idea was like make a specific game. But then the last week and after, for me, what was a good test, I started to think on going through these forms is like, actually would be maybe even easier and at the same time more wide ranging to create a kind of metagame manual. That is like, what if it's a manual that describes, oh, you're creating relations. Like, oh, here is a way to use aesthetic evocations. Here is an example form that could be created here. here's structures for membranes, and really take the examples we just listed, or some of them to put them as cases. So it's really like a kind of a toolkit in the sense of, but in the kind of from the perspective of organization. Like it's almost like an organizational building manual, but then expanded through this mechanics of games. And that I think is I'm not saying okay we must do this, but I wanted to put it on the table as an interesting possibility, because we are already kind of describing passages of it in a way. We're making examples that are already like illuminating, oh, there's that kind of area, or that kind of an area. And then I'm relatively sure, like almost absolutely sure, that there is no such thing yet.
For me, I love this idea, and it somehow kind of also relates or overlaps a bit with one of my kind of intentions, which would be using the Beve engine, like just to embed or kind of visualize some of the patterns, which from my perspective, I was more focusing on kind of the currency design space. But if you are going like this way, then I would be happy to try perhaps in parallel or in cooperation to perhaps also like try to embody it in the, or like enact it in the kind of some visual kinds of patterns within the 3D space, or some kind of space in there to make it interactive perhaps.
Yeah, and it's also like actually the currency design, token design, as the last like reference to last time, is actually part of it. It of course you can make an organization that has no token-like structures. But when you make a token, that token actually becomes usable if there is some kind of organization to it. Like if there is an exchange, it doesn't have to be one organization. It can be even organizations that others can make. Like this token opens a potential that it can be exchanged. Therefore, somebody creates an exchange, but that exchange needs to be organized into existence. Like it has to have this sort of offer interface. Underneath that, there is probably people, or if they're algorithms, they are kind of almost simulating agents like humans, and they have certain rights of, oh, now a new token appeared, I make it move here, and then I replace it with this token, whatever it is. So in this sense, like not only it's like included and kind of very welcome that there is the perspective of tokens, but it can expand the current focus on tokens, because it's actually revealing something that is ultimately part of every token. Like people say in normal language, this token can do, but if you look at what's in the token, even code side, there's none of those can do's in the token, or very few. Most of the can do's are actually in these organizations. So the organizations in a way are more foundational, and the tokens are more instrumental to those organizations or organizational possibilities.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah.
So it would be great, essentially, like that wing and your kind of emphasis on it, and also like relating to what other proposals, what other discussions, this kind of a thing would be really interesting. Also, like, okay, yeah, there is this sort of manual, but here's a coded version of an organization that was made in collaboration to test or bring out this kind of a case, etc. So all of that would actually just like positively expand all the forms that could be connected to this kind of a route. I think it's interesting, and I think it's also doable. I think in a way, like it almost makes it easier than just designing one specific game, and kind of less shackled. But because I think, for example, the ideas you all have been proposing here, like I said, like even from as reactions, they were already kind of potentially useful for such a manual, because immediately when you have possibilities, oh, you can use this sort of like evocations, and there's these styles of evocation, this style and that style. You need examples or cases. Well, there are these sort of more aesthetic evocations and soft mechanics, and then here's some examples, and here's some harder mechanics, and here's some examples and cases. And they also allow, I think, to envision a different kind of vista for organizations, because many forms that could come here might be quite alien in a good sense, like to what we consider organizations now, like something that people haven't really thought of when they're thinking of organization. Often that kind of brings to mind like, well, I would like to make a cooperative rather than a corporation because I like collaboration. But but this would rather start from the question, oh, you like collaboration. How do you actually envision the collaboration, and how could you build it? Like, here's some possibilities, and like not just the final form, take it or leave it, but rather like, hey, what about this kind of element?
I have to go soon, but maybe just like a final thought that I had was like, if we were to build something like that, I would find it interesting to also kind of design the structure within we build it using these kind of techniques.
Yeah.
and already like make this kind of like I think it can be really helpful and kind of a case already to implement this kind of I also like the atmospheric APIs, even if I never worked with APIs. This kind of more hard, soft, or atmospheric, mechanics, and like make a test of that. I don't know.
I completely agree. And I think it's almost like maybe like the word is not necessary, but it becomes much better if you do that, because then you also really understand these things. It's like, okay, these are possibilities, but what if when a new possibility is outlined, some people, not necessarily even everyone or whatever it is, like have a session, oh, let's use this and let's see what kind of form comes out of it, and kind of design from that. And after that experience, where like that in itself kind of builds this sort of much deeper understanding of what can be actually done with that. It's really like game design. That one of the dogmas of game design, which I do like, or my version of it is this game should have been playtested yesterday. It's always in that form, because it's even if you start the playtesting immediately, it would have been better if you would start earlier. So I mean, but like people write it in different forms. There's like playtesting, but it's so very strong element of saying like you need to actually playtest. And in a way, like if you make such a metaform, designing something specific out of it is already playtesting in a way. But then utilizing it is almost like a one level more of playtesting. And you can think of all those layers being useful and informative and useful processes, like fertile processes. So agreed. But that's kind of like the I know I was kind of pushing, but that we would come to design this sort of membrane in this session. But I think actually this conversation and the kind of how we populated the space of the membrane was very useful, and really brought out also this, how actually kind of starting from this sort of manual, this meta book, and also the way of envisioning new kinds of organizations through it is both useful and at the same time maybe even easier to do. And I would propose that the next session could be kind of envisioning that project, or call it whatever, like because it could take many forms, like from a book to modular web page, or both, or and a program version somewhere, like, and all of those combined to but also like there is a, like, to go to these practicalities, there is a first of all, like, there is, like, in a week there I'm supposed to give a talk from Exercise to a festival called Ouroboros. Of course, it's an online festival, which is around there's games and economics. And I said to the rest of the Exa that I would like to talk about this sort of XORG direction, which was then accepted, and also accepted by the festival. And this kind of idea, and there was some interest. Let's see what builds out of that. But as a second connection, we are opening up, let's say, more open, more porous network side of Exa. That it's I think it's a problem that everybody is either a member coming to meetings or collaborator, but outside. But what if we created this sort of rights to use the name? Not like simply open source, because that's kind of like too simple, but like that it would be much more easier for people to collaborate with it and build it. And what that can offer, of course, we don't have to use that, but that allows for the sort of possibilities of like it doesn't have to be only an Exa project precisely on that, but it allows for people to have like this kind of project and even like, yeah, speak for it, not just in the name of XORG, but in this larger Exa context and so on. And that's let's see how this possibility kind of opens, of what kind of form it exactly takes. Well, but it's relatively ready or mature. Like the forms are relatively mature, and that's nothing that kind of shackles you or this project in any way, but it's more like an option, like that it allows potentially for you to use in the name of yourself, XORG, but also Exa in larger sense. And there are some others, but I do think like those are kind of more for now, like background information, but I think they're all pointing out to kind of growing possibilities. But if we do this kind of a direction, or try to imagine it, I think that will increase the interest from these kind of possibilities, and probably other possibilities as well.
I mean, this sounds a bit like the question of how organizations can connect, doesn't it?
Yes, it is. It's very much on the same ground that we were talking about. Yeah, and there's a lot of my handprints in those structures, precisely because it's coming from the same grounds. It's imagining that. Also, the word game as the basic paradigm has been mentioned several times. But it's an instance, it's a case, and also it's a direction that I think from here, from those conversations, but also very much here, one can see that it's a design landscape. It's like, and that design landscape is almost like there's a lot to learn and a lot to kind of find out, and not everything will be revealed by one thing or even this one project, but also the doing something there, like creating something there, is probably the best way to find these things out and find out what kind of new organizational forms can be conceived through that. So what if I open a document, just something basic? I think like one could open a Etherpad, but maybe Google Doc is easier. And unless somebody objects, I can tolerate Google for now because it could be just a basic block. There's already a couple of open, but one could title it, and then so open it for everybody to edit, essentially. And then what I could promise to do during next week is write some things down just to have some material in it, like what kind of things could be there. For example, I was thinking of writing this sort of like a, I like your words actually, Martin. You had the evocation, aesthetic evocation, but then we thought about functional and so on. But there was another word you used for this first one, that display can always. What was the word you used for that?
Luckily, we pressed the recording button, but I thought it was symbolic something.
It was something I was looking at.
Symbolic affordances was maybe, could that be? That I
could have been, could have been, yes.
Yeah.
I'll check the recording. Could be, but like I distinctly remember that I liked both of the titles, but then I started talking about the evocation and forgot the first one. But yeah, like to put them under some title, I could use the evocation as we can always change these things, but I think it's a good one, like evocative mechanics, or because we always use generative, but I think evocative is actually better. Anyway, like Thea has to leave, and I think we're quite long ways, and I always find that even if sessions can continue, if you tend to stretch them, people get stressed. So I'm from my side, I think that would be a good conclusion. But any last remarks, further comments, things to still take into account?
Looking forward.
Yeah, me too. Thank you.
Good.
Yes, same.
Yeah, same here.
That's a good point to end. I'll actually stop sharing because it makes it look now we had a really good ending. I should think about the beginnings and endings. My ways of starting recording and keeping on talking is awful. And but yeah, I think it's a really
part of the. That can be part of the membrane we design.
yes, yeah,
Beginning and ending rituals.
Yeah, the kind of flow membrane. Yes, but I'll keep my promise and start to document and put things. But like, of course, everybody else can put things as well. I think it can be really like fragmentary thoughts, whatever, or questions also, like whatever it is. And we can then, in the next session, utilize that material and come to kind of envision of what should be in this kind of a thing, and how should it be approached, these kind of questions, like populating that mind space or imaginary space would be.
Would you copy today's chat also, Pekka? The Zoom.
Yeah, like
there were some nice mentions in there.
I think actually the recording saves it.
Oh yeah, true. If you store it locally, yes.
Yeah, there is a text file. I haven't put them earlier, but I can send it to. It's a file. I can either paste it or just to put the file as downloadable. It's just a text document into the Telegram. I'll do that.
I just realized I can't be here next week because I'm in a further education, but maybe I managed to hack something in the document, or we talked before, Pekko.
Yeah, I can keep you updated, and like we can talk before, after, or whatever works. Like let's do that, because it definitely would be good to keep you in the loop as well. So let's do that. And I just realized I'm super red. This is because I use vinegar as a soap, and I just went to a shower. And that's my excuse. But luckily that didn't get recorded. But it's true. Anyway, sorry for my redness. Thanks everybody. This was, I think, a great session and really good contributions. Like and I think a really also good vista played out in the front of us.
Cool. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.